Hey guys, welcome to Bedtime Sleepy, where tonight the cold has a story to tell. There's a number that doesn't quite land until you've actually been inside it. -35 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, exposed skin develops frostbite in under 5 minutes. The moisture at your lash line begins to ice over. Saliva freezes before it ever reaches the ground. Metal burns against bare hands. Not as a figure of speech, but literally. Skin adhering to iron trap springs and coming away in small, terrible strips. Every breath sends a blade through your chest, slow, drawn from the inside out. And yet, for a full decade stretching from roughly 1825 to 1840, thousands of American men lived inside exactly these conditions, not for a few days, not for a week of cold weather camping, for months, at a continuous unrelenting stretch, not in shelters with fireplaces and insulated walls, in the open wilderness of the Rocky Mountains, hundreds of miles from the nearest permanent settlement, with no rescue possible, no way to send word, no fallback plan, and no way out until the spring thaw made the passes crossable again. They didn't call it survival. They called it the season. The Rockies in January are a different world from the one that shows up in calendar photographs and national park postcards. Those peaks that look so grand and still from a distance. Under winter conditions, they become something closer to a living adversary, with no particular interest in keeping you alive. Wind at elevation doesn't blow the way a coastal storm does. It presses. It searches. It finds every seam in your clothing, every gap at the collar, every moment of stillness, and pulls the heat from your body with a patience that almost feels intentional, almost personal. The snowpack in the high mountain basins can climb to 10, 12, 15 feet deep in a heavy year, and it doesn't arrive all at once. It builds quietly, night after night, until the landscape a man thought he understood has been buried beneath a white silence that swallows every familiar landmark and replaces them with a featureless uniformity that has killed men who trusted their own memory of a place. Rivers lock up from their edges inward, the current stilled, the banks indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. Elk drop to lower elevation. Bears disappear entirely. And the men who'd come here to trap beaver, they stayed. Because there was nowhere else to go, and no honourable way to leave until they'd done what they'd been paid to come and do. These men were called mountain men, and that nickname, though it stuck with a kind of romantic permanence, doesn't quite capture what they actually were. They weren't adventurers in any leisurely sense, though adventure found most of them whether they'd planned for it or not. They weren't official explorers carrying government papers, though they mapped and named more of the American West than almost any formal expedition before or after them. They were workers, skilled, dangerous, and exhaustingly committed workers, employed by fur trading companies or operating as free trappers in a supply chain that stretched from raw Rocky Mountain wilderness all the way to the fashion houses of London and Paris. Their job was to trap beaver in mountain streams, skin them out on the spot, stretch the pelts on willow frames, dry them through whatever weather came, and haul those pelts hundreds of miles each spring to an annual gathering called the Rendezvous, where they'd trade for next year's supplies and the whole cycle would begin again. The wages were poor. The terms were often exploitative in ways the men didn't fully grasp until they were already deep in debt. The conditions were an active, continuous threat to their lives, and they went anyway, season after season, because the alternatives, the crowded eastern cities, the played-out farmland, the mill towns with their fixed wages and fixed futures, felt to many of them like a different and slower kind of dying. Why beaver? Because in the early decades of the 19th century, beaver fur was the most prized raw material in the civilized world. European men of any social standing wore felt hats, and the finest, most weatherproof felt was made from the dense underfur of the North American beaver, a material that bonded into a nearly waterproof mat under heat and pressure, and lasted for years in ways that wool and other available fibres simply didn't. A single prime beaver pelt, called a plew in the trapper's trade, could sell for $4 at Rendezvous, at a time when an Eastern labourer might earn $1 a day in a good week. The arithmetic looked compelling on paper, the way arithmetic often does before reality has a chance to revise it. What's remarkable is that men kept doing the math in favour of going back, even after their first winter had answered every question they might have asked about what the mountains actually cost. The reality meant camping above 8,000 feet in January with a wind chill no thermometer of the era had language to precisely measure. It meant wading into streams with edges already crusted in new ice before dawn just to check leg-hold traps, and it meant eating whatever the wilderness offered, which in the deep heart of winter was sometimes nothing at all for days at a stretch. The men who survived weren't the biggest, or the most aggressive, or the most recklessly brave. They were the most educated, not in any institution that handed out credentials, but in the particular, merciless, endlessly specific curriculum of the mountain itself. His name was Osborne Russell, and he was 20 years old the first time he saw the Rockies. He'd been born in 1814 in Bodenham, Maine, in a farming family that gave him basic schooling, a strong back, and not much beyond the Kennebec River Valley where he'd grown up. He left home as a teenager, drifted westward through mill towns and river settlements, worked as a labourer and briefly as a sailor on the Great Lakes, and eventually landed in 1834 in the company of Nathaniel Wyeth, a Boston ice merchant turned Western entrepreneur trying to build a fur trading empire in the Pacific Northwest. Russell signed on as one of Wyeth's labourers. He had no particular sense of what he was committing to. What he did have, and what no one who hired him could have anticipated, was a journal. A small leather-covered book in which he recorded his life in the mountains with a precision, a sensory clarity, and a disciplined attention to detail that most men of his class and era simply didn't bother cultivating. That journal, published eventually as Journal of a Trapper, outlasted him by more than a century and a half, and it remains one of the most vivid, most reliable, most humanly immediate first-person accounts of Rocky Mountain life ever set down. Russell is the reason we know what we know about what it actually felt like to be alive in the mountains in January of 1837. And his story, from the youthful optimism with which he entered the Rockies to the hard-won understanding with which he finally left them, is the spine of everything that follows. If you've found your way to this story on a quiet evening, wherever you are, settle in and let it breathe. This is the kind of history that rewards patience, because the men at the centre of it didn't rush, and rushing in the winter mountains was one of the most reliable ways to get yourself killed. If you're the kind of person who keeps stories like this going, while the night gets long and the room gets quiet, leave it running. There's no reason to be the only one listening, and if you find yourself wanting to stay for more, a subscribe costs nothing and keeps these stories coming back to you. What follows unfolds the way the mountain itself unfolds when you travel it right, layer by layer, each one revealing something the layer before had kept hidden. Because of Russell's discipline and curiosity, we know things about winter in the Rockies that most history books never bother to preserve. We know what it felt like to sleep inside a buffalo robe during a February snowstorm, frost quietly forming on the inside of the lodge above the fire's reach. We know what frostbitten hands look like when they've been thawed too quickly over an open flame, the blistering, the slow darkening of skin, the strange absence of pain in tissue that has gone quiet. We know the sound river ice makes when a spring thaw begins to crack it, a low, subterranean groan that moves upstream like something waking. We know the particular quality of stillness that settles over a mountain valley after heavy snowfall, Not the peaceful quiet of a calm afternoon, but the watchful, weighted silence of a world that's just changed itself, removed what was familiar, and left something else in its place. Russell wrote all of it down, with the care of a man who understood, perhaps instinctively, that what he was living was already becoming history. But here's what Russell's journal can't tell you, and what no journal, no history book can fully carry across time. What it would have felt like to be you standing in his place, not reading about it, waking up inside it, with the cold already deep in your bones before your eyes even open, and the particular darkness of a mountain winter pressing down on the lodge walls. Could you have done it? Not the version that gets romanticised, not the buckskin jacket and the campfire glowing against a purple mountain sunset. The real version, the one where it's been 3 days since you've eaten anything of substance, where the crack in your boot is letting in snowmelt you can feel spreading between your toes, where the temperature dropped another 12 degrees overnight and you felt it move through your sleep like a slow tide. And that detail has always stayed with me. The idea that the cold didn't wake these men, it just folded itself into their dreams, quiet and patient, the way all the worst things tend to arrive. That question, whether you could have survived what these men survived, is what this story is built to answer. And when the answer finally comes, it'll probably change something about how you understand not just the history, but yourself. Close your eyes and place yourself inside it. Not in winter. Not yet. Start in early October, when the aspens in the mountain valleys have gone that particular burning gold they reach at elevation, and the air carries its first serious warning. Nights drop below, freezing in the high country, but afternoons still climb into the 40s, and the mountains in October carry a smell that's hard to put into words. Pine resin and cold rock, and somewhere underneath it, a faint sweetness from the dried grass that survived the first frosts with its green still alive at the roots, even as the blades above the soil line have gone stiff and pale. The streams are still running fast and clear, not yet locked, not yet muffled. On a still morning you can hear them from a quarter-mile away. A constant, low, unhurried conversation between moving water and stone, one that's been happening in this valley longer than any human record goes. The camp is minimal by any standard of comfort that 1835 America would recognise. A buffalo skin lodge, the same fundamental design that Shoshone and Crow families had refined across generations, is a cone of dressed and smoked hide stretched over a frame of lodgepole pine, perhaps 14 feet across at the base, a smoke hole at the apex, a small fire at the centre doing the essential double work of cooking and heat. Inside, the smell is deeply animal, the kind that only a space shared by working men and their gear can produce. Tanned hide, wood smoke, the sweet sharp trace of beaver castoreum from the bait sticks drying near the entrance, damp wool from a capote draped over a pole to dry, the faint iron tang of trap chains coiled in the corner. The floor is layered with hides laid fur side up, and at night you pull them over yourself in careful sequence, largest first, then the smaller ones tucked at the edges, and you sleep in a warmth that feels, in the moments just before you go under, almost adequate. Almost. Because at some point before dawn the fire will have burned down to coals, and the cold will come for whatever the robes couldn't cover. A trapper's outfit in 1835, when fully assembled and loaded on a pack animal, weighed somewhere between 70 and 90 pounds. The beaver traps alone, 5 to 8 of them, each a 5-pound iron leg-hold mechanism with a chain and swivel ring, accounted for 30 to 40 of those pounds. The rifle was a flintlock plains model, accurate to perhaps 100 yards under ideal conditions which winter rarely offered. A pistol for closer work. At the body, a skinning knife at the right hip, a butcher knife at the left for field dressing, and a possible bag at the chest holding flint, steel, char cloth, and a small supply of patches, a powder horn, lead balls and linen patch material. Then the camp supplies, a wool blanket or two, a capote cut from a Hudson's Bay Company blanket, heavy and hooded, white or grey, with a hood that could be drawn tight against driving snow, tobacco, coffee when there was any, dried meat or pemmican, and whatever the country offered beyond that. This was everything. This was the entire material structure standing between a man and the mountain. The beaver themselves were creatures of extraordinary engineering, whose effect on the land the trappers understood in practical terms long before any scientist gave it a formal name. Their dam building, the felling of aspen and willow with those remarkable incisor teeth, the construction of watertight walls across moving streams, the careful management of pond depth through channels and overflow structures, creates wetland habitat of real productivity. A single active beaver complex can quietly transform a dry mountain valley into a thriving wetland that supports bird colonies, fish spawning, elk and deer forage, and water storage that smooths out spring flooding and summer drought. The best beaver habitat in the Rockies of the 1830s was also, almost by definition, the most physically demanding terrain to work. High mountain streams running through narrow, steep-walled drainages, surrounded by deadfall and loose snow, often reachable only by wading. Because a trap set from the bank leaves a human scent trail that even a beaver will detect and avoid. You had to be in the water, you had to be cold, it wasn't optional, and there was no alternative that actually worked. Think about setting a trap in the hour before dawn in late October. The stream runs perhaps knee-deep in the channel, with edges already crusted overnight in new ice that breaks under your moccasins, with a thin, high sound like fractured porcelain. You work with bare hands, because gloves don't allow the fine control that setting the pan of an iron spring trap requires. Within 90 seconds of contact with the water, your fingertips are gone to sensation. You're working from knowledge now, not touch. You coat a small stick with castoreum, the secretion from the beaver's own scent glands, which draws other beavers the way a specific frequency draws a particular instrument, and position it carefully above the trap's trigger point. Then you wade back to the bank and wait for your circulation to return, which it does over the next several minutes in small, specific stabs of pain that travel outward from your palms toward each finger. You repeat this 12 to 20 times a day, every day the weather holds, from October until the streams freeze entirely and trapping becomes mechanically impossible for the season. The social world of the Rocky Mountain trapper revolved in its annual rhythm around the rendezvous, a summer gathering held in an agreed valley each July, where trappers, fur company agents, and Native American traders converged for intense commercial exchange and something that passed for celebration. The first rendezvous was held in 1825 on the Henry's Fork of the Green River, in what's now southwestern Wyoming. A trapper would bring in his season's accumulated pelts and trade them for next year's supplies at prices set entirely by the company agents, men who'd hauled goods from St. Louis at considerable cost and charged accordingly, typically 3 to 5 times the eastern retail price for everything from gunpowder to coffee. Most trappers ended each rendezvous deeper in debt than they'd arrived, which wasn't a miscalculation on anyone's part. It was a design feature of the whole arrangement. The gathering was also a release valve, horse races, shooting competitions, gambling, and enough drinking to soften the memory of what the last 9 months had actually been. But rendezvous was summer. By September, the high passes were dusting with new snow, and by October the decision had to be made: where to winter. This wasn't a casual choice. A good winter camp required a very specific set of conditions: timber close enough for steady fuel, reliable game within reach, terrain that blocked the worst of the northern wind, access to water that stayed at least partially open through the cold months, and critically, proximity to a Native American community whose people held the kind of deep, specific knowledge that surviving a mountain winter actually required. Many of the most experienced trappers spent those months in or near Shoshone, Crow, or Flathead villages, and those arrangements were survival strategies as much as anything else. The men who tried to winter alone, or in small isolated groups without Indigenous neighbours, suffered disproportionately. What's remarkable is how consistently that pattern held, and how rarely it makes it into the stories that got told about mountain men later on. The mountain in winter didn't reward independence pursued for its own sake. It asked for something harder and more countercultural for a certain kind of American man. It asked for humility. By December, the world above 10,000 feet had become something categorically different from what summer offered. Light arrived at a low angle, giving familiar terrain and unfamiliar geometry. The cold stopped being merely uncomfortable and became structural. It didn't just make you shiver. It reorganized your priorities, made every action a quiet calculation against the heat it cost you. Because heat was now your most valuable resource, and every calorie spent was a calorie that had to come from somewhere. The smell of wood smoke from the lodge stopped being comfort and became necessity, the smell of the one thing standing between you and the temperature waiting just outside the hide walls. Somewhere inside that cold and that particular mountain darkness, every man who spent a winter in the Rockies eventually arrived at the same question. What did he actually know about surviving this? And how much of what he thought he knew had come from someone other than himself? The answer, it turned out, was the most important knowledge the mountains held, and where it came from would quietly challenge everything the mythology of the mountain man was later built to claim. There's a particular mythology that smells like leather and wood smoke, and seems, from the comfortable distance of 2 centuries, almost entirely self-contained. The mountain man of American popular memory is a singular, self-generating figure. He stands alone on a ridge above the tree line, a rifle in his hand, a robe on his back, nothing between himself and the horizon. He traps because he loves freedom. He's in the mountains because civilization has nothing to offer a man of his kind. He needs no one. He asks for nothing. He survives because he's strong enough to, and that strength is his alone, earned by sheer force of character against a wilderness that he has, through will, persuaded to sustain him. That's the mythology, and like most mythologies, it contains just enough truth to make the larger distortion almost impossible to see through without looking very carefully. Most people who know anything about the Rocky Mountain trappers believe some version of this story, that they were free spirits, wanderers, men who deliberately stepped outside the social and economic machinery of American life to live by their own rules in a wilderness only they were capable of handling. The mountain man became the prototype of a certain American masculine ideal, independent, resourceful, answerable to no one, shaped by nature rather than by society. Davy Crockett, Hugh Glass, Kit Carson, Jim Bridger. The mythology ran so deep that it survived the 19th century whole, got amplified by dime novels and Wild West shows, found its way into film and television, and was absorbed into the foundational DNA of how Americans understood themselves. The man who needs nothing from anyone, the man who can handle whatever the world offers, because he is, essentially, enough on his own. But here's the truth the mythology has carefully and persistently obscured for 200 years. The vast majority of Rocky Mountain trappers in the peak years of the trade weren't free men operating outside the economic system. They were employees, or they were debtors. In many cases, both at the same time. The mountain man was, in the most structurally accurate description available, a labourer in the most ambitious corporate extractive enterprise in pre-Civil War America. The fur trading system was controlled by entities like the American Fur Company, founded and operated by John Jacob Astor of New York, who became the wealthiest man in America during this period, not by entering the mountains himself, not by trapping a single beaver, but by owning the company that sent other men there and sold them their supplies at monopoly prices. The trappers who worked as company men, called hired men in the trade, received fixed wages, typically $300 to $400 a year, out of which they were expected to purchase their own equipment at prices the company set without competition. Many entered the system in debt on their first day and never fully climbed out. The rendezvous system was also the mechanism by which the fur companies maintained effective economic control over their workforce across hundreds of miles of unmapped wilderness. A trapper who owed money to the company couldn't simply walk away. His debt followed him across the Continental Divide and showed up in the company ledger at the next summer gathering with interest. Because the company controlled the entire supply chain, every trap, every pound of gunpowder, every yard of cloth, every ounce of coffee that entered the mountains had to come through them. Prices were carefully set to keep a man solvent enough to return, but not quite solvent enough to become genuinely free. This wasn't coincidence, it was deliberate structural design. In its economic mechanics, the fur trade sat far closer to the company town model that would define the industrial era of the late 19th century than to any romantic vision of frontier liberty. The mountains were the factory floor, the beaver were the raw material, and the men working those streams in January were the labour force. There was a category called the free trapper, men who worked outside direct company employment, on their own routes, their own account. Osborne Russell became one of these men after his initial seasons as a company labourer, and free trapping offered real advantages: freedom to choose your own territory, set your own camp, make your own calls. But it also meant that the risks the company had previously absorbed, a horse lost in a Blackfoot raid, a full season's trap swallowed by a spring flood, now fell entirely on the individual trapper's account. A free trapper who strung together 2 or 3 bad seasons could find himself with no horses, no equipment, no credit, and no real option but to walk back into a company arrangement on whatever terms they chose to offer. Freedom in the fur trade was real, but it was conditional, and the conditions were stacked in favour of the people who already had capital. And here's the most surprising truth of all, the one that cuts most directly against everything the mythology was built to claim. Survival in the Rocky Mountains wasn't an individual achievement, it was a collective one. The mythology gets this exactly backwards. The men who lasted, who accumulated multiple seasons in the mountains, who came out with their health and their faculties, who were still alive in their 40s with something to show for it, were almost without exception men who travelled in groups, shared knowledge freely, and maintained active and genuine relationships with Native American communities. Their individual competence only held value inside the wider network of information and mutual support surrounding it. The trapping brigade wasn't merely an economic unit designed to maximize output. It was a survival structure, more eyes watching for movement in the timber, more hands available when a man broke through river ice, more accumulated knowledge about which passes stayed open longest, which valleys held game in January, which streams still ran deep enough under ice to trap in February. Most people don't realize how thoroughly that communal reality was written out of the story that came later. The mythology of the lone mountain man wasn't invented by accident. It was constructed, deliberately and for specific cultural purposes, by people who came after the trappers. writers of dime novels and newspaper dispatches, promoters of Wild West shows, authors of government expedition reports that transform the chaotic, communal, Indigenous knowledge-dependent reality of the trapping world into a narrative of American masculine destiny. The Mountain Man Who Needed Nothing from Anyone was a story America needed to tell itself during the era of westward expansion, because it resolved, in mythological terms if not historical ones, the violence and the dispossession and the ecological damage that actual expansion required. You can't tell a complicated story about dependence and partnership and shared knowledge and simultaneously argue that the continent west of the Mississippi was empty and waiting for anyone strong enough to take it. The mythology served the expansion, and the expansion made the mythology necessary. The truth is simultaneously less romantic and considerably more interesting than anything the mythology ever offered. Understanding what it actually took to survive a Rocky Mountain winter, the real toolkit, the real dependencies, the real human network that made 9 months in the mountains something other than a death sentence, means setting down the solitary hero first. It means asking a different question than the one the mythology poses. Not, could you have survived alone? But, would you have been humble enough, attentive enough, and genuinely open enough to learn from every source that survival required? Because the answer to that second question, the answer the actual historical record provides, through men like Osborne Russell who lived it and had the discipline to write it down, comes from the most unexpected place the mythology ever tried to erase. The indigenous communities who'd been surviving that specific mountain winter for thousands of years before a single American trapper was ever born. There's a man writing by firelight. The lodge is warm enough, barely, and the smoke from the pinewood fire has mostly found its way out through the hole at the top, with just enough left behind to give the air a grey, eye-watering quality you stop noticing after the first few months, because there's simply nothing to be done about it. Outside, it's February somewhere in the Yellowstone country. The temperature has been below zero for a week without a break. He's propped on one elbow, journal open against his knee, writing in a hand that's deliberate and small, conserving paper, because paper is irreplaceable until next rendezvous in July. 5 months away. His name is Osborne Russell, and he's 23 years old. He's been in the mountains for 3 years. In that time, he's been shot at, gone without food for 4 consecutive days, frozen his hands badly enough twice to lose feeling in 2 fingers for weeks, and been knocked from a horse by a grizzly's swipe. He survived all of it without losing the habit, the compulsion almost, of writing things down. Russell was born in 1814 in Bodenham, Maine, a farming community on the Kennebec River about 20 miles from the Atlantic coast. His family wasn't wealthy, but they were steady. Farming people, church-going in the way that was simply expected in that time and place, and literate in the New England tradition that treated basic reading and writing as a civic obligation. He received enough formal schooling to read with confidence and write with the kind of clarity that only comes from genuine practice, not just technical training. The texture of his journal suggests he read widely. His pages carry biblical references and classical allusions in the way a person calls up things they've genuinely absorbed rather than merely displayed. He was, by every piece of evidence he left behind, a naturally curious man, the kind who notices specific details because he's actually interested in them. He left home as a teenager, probably around 1830 when he was 16. The journal doesn't explain why in any single direct passage. What it reveals is a personality that found the fixed horizons of rural Maine insufficient, not with bitterness toward home or family, but with a quiet decisiveness that reads as entirely natural in someone who simply needed more room than the Kennebec Valley could offer. He worked his way westward through mill towns and river ports, spent time on the Great Lakes, and eventually landed in Missouri in the early 1830s, within reach of the fur trade world that was by then the most economically active and geographically ambitious enterprise on the American frontier. When Nathaniel Wyeth organised his second expedition to the Pacific Northwest in 1834, Russell signed on. He was 20 years old, unknown, and almost certainly looked exactly like what he was. A lean, capable young man from rural New England who had enough practical sense not to ask too many questions about what he didn't yet know, and enough genuine curiosity to want to find out. The 1834 Wyeth expedition was a formative disaster in the business sense, and a transformative education in the personal one. Wyeth's commercial ambitions didn't survive contact with the already established Hudson's Bay Company and Rocky Mountain Fur Company, both of which had territorial advantages and institutional resources he couldn't come close to matching. But for Russell, the trip was an education that no school could have provided in a decade of formal study. He crossed the continental divide for the first time, and wrote about it with the attentiveness of someone who understood even then that he was seeing something he'd never see quite the same way again. He moved through the Yellowstone country, the geysers, hot springs, obsidian cliffs, steaming rivers, and described them with a precision that reads, 2 centuries later, like careful field reporting. He met Shoshone, Bannock and Flathead people, and wrote about those encounters with the respect of a man who recognized quickly that the people across from him knew things he genuinely needed to learn. By the close of 1834, he was no longer a newcomer from the East. He was becoming something more specific and considerably more durable. What makes Russell's journal stand apart? What makes it a different kind of document from most primary sources the Mountain Man era produced isn't solely the events it records, it's the sensibility behind it. He wasn't reckless in the way mythology tends to glorify. He paid attention in a consistent, disciplined, almost methodical way. He noticed things that other men, caught up in the immediate physical demands of the trapping life, apparently never registered. The way a particular canyon changed its character between October and February, the behavior of beaver in high-altitude streams, the plant life of alpine meadows and the seasonal availability of edible species, the patterns elk and buffalo followed in response to specific depths of snowfall. He was, in the language we'd reach for today, an ecological observer, a man who understood intuitively that the mountain was a living system, and that surviving within a system required actually understanding it. Russell also formed relationships that quietly complicated the mythology of solitary self-sufficiency. Before that mythology had fully settled into the shape it would eventually take, he spent multiple winters in or near Shoshone communities, and his accounts of those periods are among the most humanly textured passages in the entire journal. He describes the social life of winter lodges with a warmth and specificity that points to genuine familiarity, not the strained proximity of a man enduring an unwanted dependency, but the ease of someone who'd built real trust over time. He mentions Shoshone and Bannock guides by name across multiple seasons. He records conversations with older men whose knowledge of the local terrain was the product of full lifetimes spent in it. And in several passages he acknowledges directly that his survival in particular situations was owed to information or help from native neighbours who had no obligation to offer it, and who did so anyway, through a relationship of reciprocity that Russell genuinely seemed to understand and to honour. What strikes me most is how clearly he saw that, and how honestly he wrote it down, at a time when most men in his position wouldn't have thought it worth mentioning at all. The winter passages in Russell's journal are particularly valuable because they're specific in the way that lived experience is specific, and that generalized historical narrative almost never is. He doesn't write, "It was cold," He writes about the texture of cold at a particular elevation, under particular conditions. He describes moisture freezing in a man's beard during a hard freeze, and having to be thawed carefully before moving your jaw, otherwise it pulls the skin. He writes about keeping beaver pelts pliable enough to stretch without cracking when temperatures drop below zero. He describes the quality of light in the Yellowstone Basin in January, a particular clear, pale blue he associates with safety, because it means the sky is open and the cold, while severe, is at least stable and readable. Unlike the flat white sky that precedes a blizzard, which gives a man perhaps 4 hours to find adequate shelter before the full weight of the thing arrives. Osborne Russell stayed in the Rocky Mountains for 9 years, from 1834 to 1843, an extraordinarily long career in a world where the average active tenure lasted 3 to 5 seasons, and where a career longer than that usually ended in injury, poverty, or death. He survived everything the mountains offered. He was shot by Blackfoot warriors in an ambush that destroyed his supplies, and left him 60 miles from help with an arrow wound in his hip. He endured winters that killed entire brigades' horses, and left men snowbound for weeks on emergency rations of boiled rawhide. He outlasted the fur trade itself, finally leaving the Rockies in 1843, only because the trade had contracted so completely that there was no longer any viable reason to stay. And when he went, he took the journal with him. 9 years of watching and learning and surviving, recorded in the careful, unhurried hand of a man who never, in 9 years of having a dozen better excuses not to, stopped paying attention. There's a plant that grows in the high valleys of the Rocky Mountains called yampa. It's a species of wild carrot, Peridoridia Gairdneri, whose tuberous roots, when roasted or boiled, provide a dense, starchy calorie source that carried entire indigenous communities through winters when large game was unavailable or too risky to pursue in deep snow. The Shoshone knew exactly where to find it, in the specific pockets of terrain where it grew in concentration. They knew how to harvest it in late summer before the ground hardened, how to dry and store the roots through autumn, and how to prepare them in winter so the body could make the most of them. Osborne Russell knew about yampa because Shoshone people told him. He ate it because they offered it. And in at least one winter passage of his journal, he notes, without any apparent self-consciousness, that the yampa, alongside dried buffalo meat and pine nuts prepared in the Shoshone way, was the difference between his party getting through a particular February in serviceable condition and not getting through at all. Here's the perspective shift that fundamentally changes the story of the Rocky Mountain trapper, the one the mythology has spent 200 years working to keep you from seeing clearly. The mountain man wasn't a self-created figure who bent a wilderness to his will through personal force. He was, in the most literal and consequential sense, a student of the indigenous communities who had lived in the Rocky Mountains for thousands of years and who carried a depth of knowledge about those mountains, ecological, meteorological, medical, logistical, botanical, navigational, that no American newcomer could develop in a single career or a generation or a lifetime of effort disconnected from that accumulated tradition. The trappers who survived were the ones who recognized this and responded with genuine humility. The ones who didn't appear in the historical record as brief, laconic notations in other men's journals, here today, missing by spring, found or not found by summer. The transfer of knowledge was comprehensive, continuous, and multi-directional, even if it wasn't balanced in terms of the power surrounding it. Native communities gave trappers mountain routes that avoided the deadliest avalanche corridors and the passes that closed first in the season. They shared information about game movement that was the product of observational knowledge built across generations. Where the elk would be in January given a specific pattern of November snowfall, where the buffalo chose to winter in a heavy year, which drainage systems held fish beneath the ice. They offered medical knowledge that, in a world without antibiotics, was often the only thing separating a wound from a death sentence. Poultice preparations from specific plants, root-based treatments for fever, techniques for cleaning and binding injuries that the mainstream European tradition had no functional equivalent for out in the open field. And they shared the technical knowledge behind the material culture that made winter survivable in the first place. Hide preparation methods, clothing designs, shelter construction principles that the men who lasted season after season quietly depended on. Consider the buffalo robe. It was the primary sleeping and cold weather insulation system for most trappers across most of the era. A prime winter robe, taken from an adult animal in December or January when the coat had reached its fullest density, weighed 8 to 12 pounds, and provided thermal insulation comparable to a modern sleeping bag rated to 20 below zero. The Shoshone, Crow, Blackfoot, and other mountain and plains peoples had been processing and using these robes for generations, and the technique required to produce a usable robe from a raw hide was a complex multi-step process. It involved brain tanning, using the animal's own brain tissue, broken down in water, to soften and preserve the skin, followed by smoking to make it waterproof, and then hours of repeated handworking to achieve the suppleness that separated a functional robe from a stiff, brittle board. The women of these communities were the primary experts in this process. Without the buffalo robe, the mountain man doesn't survive November. That's not an exaggeration. It's a material fact. Many mountain men, perhaps the majority of those who wintered extensively in the Rockies, formed long-term relationships with Native American women, and those relationships were simultaneously personal and practical in a way the era had no clean vocabulary for. A Shoshone or Crow woman in a winter mountain camp wasn't merely a companion in the domestic sense. She was, in concrete and measurable terms, a survival expert whose knowledge of the surrounding landscape was the product of a lifetime of close attention and her community's deep accumulated teaching. She knew which plants could be safely eaten under winter conditions, and which were toxic in ways that resembled edible ones, closely enough to be dangerous. She knew how to prepare food for maximum caloric return in the cold. She read atmospheric signs of an approaching blizzard hours before any European-trained observer would even register them as meaningful. She knew how to build and maintain a lodge that held heat efficiently through a hard night. She knew how to dress wounds using materials available in the winter landscape. She knew, in short, most of what the mountain required, because she'd been learning it since she was old enough to follow her mother through the valley in October. The rendezvous, understood through this lens, wasn't primarily a commercial event where native participants brought trade goods to a market controlled by fur company agents. It was an annual convergence of multiple knowledge systems. Shoshone, Bannock, Flathead, Nez Perce, and other communities weren't just bringing hides and horses. They were bringing information, relationships, and practical expertise that the entire enterprise of Rocky Mountain trapping depended on for its continuation. They shared geographic knowledge that shaped the following year's trapping routes. They provided intertribal political intelligence that allowed trappers to move through the region's complex alliance structures without triggering conflicts that would have gotten them killed. None of this diminishes the genuine competence and courage that men like Russell developed through their years in the mountains. After 9 winters, his practical knowledge of the Rockies was formidable by any measure, hard-won, layered, and directly applicable. But this reframing is historically necessary, because it corrects a fundamental distortion that has shaped not just the story of the Mountain Man era, but the broader narrative of American westward expansion. The mythology of rugged self-sufficiency has always been, at its foundation, a story about not needing anyone else. The actual history of Rocky Mountain survival is, in every measurable dimension, a story about exactly the opposite. The absolute non-negotiable necessity of connection, teaching, partnership, and humility before forms of knowledge you didn't arrive with and couldn't produce alone. Understanding this truth isn't just an academic correction. It changes the nature of the survival question this story has been asking from the beginning. The question was never really whether you could have been strong enough or tough enough or brave enough to endure a Rocky Mountain winter. The question is whether you could have been humble enough, whether you could have received knowledge from sources your culture told you were beneath you, used methods you didn't invent, depended on people you were simultaneously displacing, and done all of this with enough consistency and genuine reciprocity that those people would have been willing to keep teaching you. That's a different kind of challenge from anything the mythology ever posed, and it's the challenge that was already building through the specific collision of forces gathering in the Yellowstone country in the summer of 1837, toward the crisis that would test everything Osborne Russell had learned, and everything he was still going to need to learn to survive it. The valley that Osborne Russell called the most beautiful place he'd ever seen sits at roughly 7,000 feet in what is now the northeastern corner of Yellowstone National Park. It runs east to west, perhaps 8 miles in length and 2 miles across at its widest, with the Lamar River threading through its centre over a bed of smooth, rounded stones. The surrounding mountains rise to 10,000 and 12,000 feet on both sides, and that elevation, that particular enclosure, makes the valley feel held rather than exposed, sheltered, defined by the kind of clear geographic logic that a man who spent enough time moving through the mountains learns to recognize as a quiet form of safety. In late summer, the grass along the valley floor is thick and rich, and the elk come down from the high timber in the early morning in numbers that Russell described with the astonishment of someone who'd seen a great many elk. But never quite like this. Hundreds of them sometimes, moving through the ground mist that rises off the river in the hour after dawn, in long, unhurried lines that follow the same routes they'd taken the morning before and the morning before that. By August of 1837, Russell was part of a small group moving through the Yellowstone country in search of late summer beaver sign. The larger brigade he'd been attached to through the earlier part of the season had dispersed after rendezvous, as they typically did, with smaller parties fanning out to cover different drainage systems before the autumn trapping season fully opened. Russell's group, 3 men by his account in the relevant journal entries, was a standard unit for that kind of work, small enough to move quietly through country where quiet mattered, large enough to offer some basic mutual protection in terrain where the Blackfoot Confederacy had been growing increasingly aggressive in its resistance to trapping parties moving through their land. 3 men, 2 rifles, and the particular warm morning ease of a place Russell had been before, a place that felt, in some tentative and ultimately dangerous way, familiar. It was early morning, the light still flat and grey with the sun not yet over the eastern ridge, when Blackfoot warriors came out of the timber on the north side of the valley. Russell's journal entry for the attack is one of the most precisely rendered passages in the entire document, written with the compressed clarity of a man who'd processed what happened very quickly, under conditions that demanded speed, and who needed to set the record straight before the details began to fade. There were approximately 9 warriors. They came at full gallop and were within effective rifle range within seconds of breaking from the trees. Russell fired and missed, a failure he records without excuse. His companion's rifle misfired, and then there was an arrow through Russell's right hip, the shaft entering from the side and stopping deep in the muscle tissue, not deep enough to strike bone, but fully deep enough that movement was, immediately, a different category of problem than it had been 30 seconds before. The 3 trappers broke for the river. It was the only tactical option the terrain offered, because the open ground between their position and the far timber gave the mounted warriors a clear field of fire and a speed advantage that men on foot couldn't overcome. Russell ran, though the word is almost wrong for what you do with an arrow seated in your hip. He moved, and he moved with the kind of speed the body can produce under threat that it cannot generate any other way. The deeper animal machinery of survival overriding whatever pain signals were competing for his attention. His companion took an arrow through the hand during the crossing. They reached the river, stumbled over the loose stones of the Lamar's bed, the cold water grabbing at their knees and thighs, and pushed through to the far bank and the heavier timber beyond. There, the trees gave enough cover that the mounted warriors couldn't follow effectively. The Blackfoot pulled up at the river's edge. They'd taken what the raid required: the horses, the camp, the supplies, the traps, the season's accumulated work. What they left behind were 3 wounded men, no horses, no food, no fire-starting equipment, no robes, no traps, and 60 miles between themselves and the nearest help. Russell's account of the hours that followed is almost matter-of-fact in its practicality, and that quality, perhaps more than anything else in the document, reveals the kind of man the mountains had made him. There was an arrow in his hip. He noted it. He assessed the depth and angle as carefully as he could without being able to see the wound directly. He concluded that it had to come out, that the process was going to be painful in a way he apparently judged unproductive to dwell on, and that delay offered no strategic advantage. His companion helped with the extraction, a process Russell declines to describe in any detail, an uncharacteristic omission that suggests either the specifics were too difficult to render in prose, or that he considered them too obvious for any reader who understood what the situation required. What he does record is that when the shaft came free, the bleeding was significant but eventually controllable. The wound was packed with moss from the riverbank and strips of shirt, bound as tightly as the available materials allowed. 3 injured men, no horses, no food, no fire-starting equipment. The powder and flint had been in the camp supplies the Blackfoot now held. No blankets, no robes. It was August, so the mountain nights dropped to the low 40s rather than below 0. But the situation had shifted, in roughly 15 minutes of chaos and pain, from a routine late summer operation into one of the most dangerous positions 3 men in the Rocky Mountains could occupy. Injured, unsupplied, on foot, in country that held both active raiders and terrain that would turn genuinely lethal the moment the season changed, which at 7,000 feet was a matter of weeks, not months. Every day spent in place was a day closer to October. Every day closer to October was a day closer to something far worse than an arrow wound. They spent that first night in the timber with no fire. A fire was a signal, and a signal in those circumstances was an invitation. Russell described the night with a single word in his journal: long. Just that, unelaborated, standing alone in the entry. But it carries everything it needs to carry when you understand the context. Lying in wet clothing in a mountain, August night dropping into the low 40s, a fresh arrow wound in his hip beginning to stiffen as the initial shock wore off, listening to the dark for sounds that would mean the raiders had decided the business wasn't finished. By morning, the wound had locked up considerably. The hip still moved, but not cleanly. The sharp, clarifying agony of the injury had settled into the deeper, duller, more persistent ache of a wound that was going to be part of the daily physical landscape for a long time ahead. They had to travel anyway. There was no other plan. Russell's account of the days that followed, the slow, painful march south and east out of the Lamar Valley toward the nearest Shoshone winter camp, is a study in the kind of survival that mythology consistently struggles to romanticize, because it has none of the dramatic moments that make for satisfying storytelling. It was simply walking, slowly, carefully, in pain, watching the wound for the early signs of infection that would shift the situation from difficult to fatal, eating what the late summer landscape could offer, sleeping in whatever shelter the terrain allowed. But here's what the physical ordeal had been quietly concealing. The Lamar Valley attack wasn't a random act of violence that interrupted an otherwise sustainable enterprise. It was the visible result of structural forces that had been building for years. Economic pressures that the men in the mountains couldn't see clearly and couldn't influence, operated by institutions they barely understood, serving a market that was already, invisibly and irreversibly, deciding it didn't need them anymore. The arrow in Russell's hip was the readable symptom of a much deeper condition, and the disease was the fur trade's own collapse, already terminal, even if no one in that cold, quiet timber had any way of knowing it yet. The smell of a high-quality beaver felt hat, a Bond Street hat, properly blocked and finished, is lanolin and steam and a faint, warm animal undertone that its owner almost certainly never consciously registers. Over time, it blends with wool and sweat and London rain into something that simply smells like his hat, a familiar thing, an unremarkable part of his daily life. But that hat, that entirely ordinary artifact of male respectability in the 1820s and 1830s, available at any decent haberdasher in London or New York or Boston, was the reason Osborne Russell was standing in a mountain stream before dawn in the dark. It was the reason the Lamar Valley had trappers in it at all. It was the reason the Blackfoot were engaged in an increasingly organised effort to remove them. The beaver felt hat was the engine of the entire mechanism, and by the mid-1830s that engine was already failing, though no one in the mountains had yet been told. Fashion is a form of technology, and like all technologies, it can be displaced by a better alternative at a speed that leaves the industries built around the old one with very little time to respond. In London, in the early 1820s, silk top hats began appearing among the fashionable classes, first as novelties for the very wealthy, then as aspirational markers for the prosperous middle, and eventually as the standard accessory for any man of means who wanted to signal modernity. Silk hats were lighter than beaver felt. They held a more precise shape. They could be made brighter and more visually striking than the organic variability of felt ever allowed. And they were cheaper to manufacture, not cheaper for the buyer, who still paid premium prices, but cheaper for the maker, because silk moved through established trade networks that didn't require sending men into the Rocky Mountains at mortal risk. The shift from beaver felt to silk wasn't a single event with a clear date. It was a gradual market change that gathered momentum through the 1820s and 1830s, and its effects on the price of raw beaver pelts were already measurable at Rocky Mountain Rendezvous by the mid-part of that decade. Here's the hidden layer beneath the Lamar Valley attack. Beneath every Blackfoot raid in the late 1830s, beneath the entire desperate push of trapping brigades into increasingly dangerous territory in the final years of the fur trade era, the men who ran the companies knew the trade was contracting. The people at the top of the fur trade hierarchy were watching the price of beaver pelts fall at each successive rendezvous through the 1830s, and they were making financial decisions in response to what that data was telling them. Astor, by any measure the most commercially sophisticated person connected to the Western fur trade, sold his American Fur Company's Western operations in 1834. This same year, Osborne Russell arrived in the mountains for the first time, full of 20-year-old anticipation and completely unaware that the man who'd built the industry he was entering had just decided to walk away from it. Astor saw what was coming. He had the information and the institutional vantage point to see it clearly. He got out. The men in the mountains had neither. The price records from the rendezvous tell the story without ambiguity. At the gathering of 1832, a prime beaver pelt sold for approximately $5. By 1836, the figure had dropped to around $3.50. By 1838, it was hovering closer to $3. By 1840, the final year of the formal rendezvous system, prices had fallen to the point where many trappers couldn't cover their accumulated debt with a full season's haul. The declining numbers weren't solely the result of the European fashion shift, though that was the primary demand-side driver. The beaver population itself had been so dramatically reduced by 2 decades of intensive trapping across virtually every accessible Rocky Mountain drainage that scarcity on the supply side was compounding the market collapse at the same time. The men were working harder, covering more depleted ground for less return, taking greater risks to find fresh sign, and pushing into buffer zones like the deeper Yellowstone country that earlier trappers had treated as off-limits, precisely because the Blackfoot held that territory seriously and had made that plain. The Blackfoot Confederacy, a loose alliance of related groups including the Piegan, Blood and Blackfoot proper, had maintained one of the most effectively organised responses to the expansion of the fur trade into their lands of any native people in the Rocky Mountain region. Their resistance wasn't irrational, and it wasn't simply reactive. It was strategic in a way that reflected a clear and accurate understanding of what the trade's presence actually meant for their territory and their food systems. The beaver weren't an incidental resource. The wetland systems those animals created and maintained supported the riparian habitats that concentrated game, provided water sources for both human communities and the animals they hunted, and kept the streams healthy enough to support fish populations through all seasons. Removing the beaver didn't simply eliminate a fur-bearing animal. It drained the ecological foundation of an entire landscape. The Blackfoot understood this not in theoretical terms, but in the direct practical terms of people who depended on that landscape for everything. Their raids on trapping brigades were a consistent, decades-long message delivered in the only language the fur companies seemed capable of hearing. This is the structural machinery beneath what happened in the Lamar Valley in August of 1837. The men in the mountains were being pressed into increasingly dangerous territory by economic forces they couldn't see, operated by people they'd never meet, in service of a market that had already quietly moved on from what the mountain men were producing. Osborne Russell was in the Lamar Valley that morning not because of poor judgment or avoidable recklessness. He was there because the better established trapping grounds further south were depleted, and the pressure to find fresh beaver sign had pushed his party north and east into country that every experienced trapper knew was held by people who'd communicated their position clearly, repeatedly, and for years. What strikes a careful reader of the primary sources from this period is how completely absent any awareness of an ending is among the trappers themselves. Russell's journal through 1837 and 1838 reads like the record of a man who fully expects the system he's operating within to continue indefinitely, planning for future seasons, assessing his horses for the year ahead, thinking in the rhythms of a life he has every reason to believe will persist. He was still inside the story, still committed to its premises. He had no way of knowing that by 1840 the rendezvous system would simply be discontinued, that the fur companies would be in active withdrawal from the mountain trade, that the entire world in which he'd built his skills, his knowledge, and his deepest relationships would cease to exist as a functioning enterprise within a few years of his worst moment inside it. And yet, and this is what makes the story ultimately about something more than economic misfortune. When the mountain did its worst to Russell in the weeks following the Lamar Valley attack, the system that had sent him there had already, in any meaningful sense, let him go. His survival wasn't a product of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company or the rendezvous supply chain or any institutional arrangement. It was the product of everything he'd built for himself across 9 years in the mountains: the knowledge, the relationships, the physical discipline, the habits of careful attention, and the specific combination of hard-won competence and genuine humility before what the mountain was still teaching him. The question of exactly how he made it through, and what that process reveals about the deeper nature of survival, is the part of this story the mythology has always wanted to claim, and has always gotten wrong. The smell of pine resin in cold air is sharper than in summer, cleaner, more astringent, stripped of whatever secondary notes warmth adds, and reduced to its essential quality, the smell of a tree defending itself against something. In the days after the Lamar Valley attack, Russell and his two companions found pine sap to be one of their first medical resources. Applied directly to the arrow wound in his hip, it provided a crude but functionally real antiseptic and binding agent that, combined with the moss already packed against the puncture, slowed the bacterial progression that warm August conditions would otherwise have encouraged. He doesn't describe this as a clever improvisation. He describes it as the obvious solution. And that detail, right there, tells you precisely and without embellishment what 9 years in the mountains had done to his sense of what the surrounding landscape could offer. They walked for 5 days before reaching any form of help. The terrain between the Lamar Valley and the nearest Shoshone winter camp wasn't catastrophically difficult by Rocky Mountain standards. No major passes to cross, no swollen rivers in late summer, mostly timbered valleys and open basin grassland at moderate elevation. But it was 60 miles of rough ground, covered by 3 injured men moving at the pace that injured men can sustain, slowly, with more frequent stops than any of them found comfortable, with a particular exhausted deliberateness of people who understood that one additional injury, a twisted ankle on loose rock, a bad fall at a stream crossing, could be the one that ended the calculation entirely. By the second day, Russell's hip wound had begun to drain. In the context of 1837 wound management, that was a measurably good sign. Drainage meant the body was doing what it was supposed to do. Systemic infection was another matter, another smell, another colour, another heat in the tissue around the wound. And he was watching for it carefully. Watching the way you watch for something that might kill you, and that you can't treat if it actually arrives. They ate what the mountain offered at late summer, without spending more energy in the getting than the food would return. That's a calculation any experienced mountain traveller made almost automatically, and one the inexperienced got fatally wrong. Grasshoppers, plentiful in the high meadows in August, provided protein and fat in a form that required no hunting and almost no preparation. Pine nuts from the white bark cones scattered across south-facing slopes could be cracked against stone and delivered a dense caloric return. Roots that Russell identified by the Shoshone names he'd been taught across multiple winter seasons, yampa, biscuit root, others, were dug with a sharpened stick wherever the ground was soft enough to allow it. On the third day they killed a porcupine. Russell noted it as significant good fortune. The meat was sweet, and the fat was thick enough to be useful for treating the raw skin on his companion's arrow-damaged hand. That night he wrote all of it down, sitting against a tree trunk, journal propped on his knee, the hip aching at the steady baseline he'd apparently decided to simply incorporate into his operating conditions for the foreseeable future. They reached a Shoshone winter camp on approximately the 6th day. Russell's dating is slightly imprecise in this section of the journal, which suggests the work of covering ground had left him with very little cognitive surplus for precise calendar tracking. The reception, by his account, was immediate and genuinely warm rather than merely formal. Food was brought out. The wound in his hip was examined by people who had treated arrow injuries before, with the ease of experience rather than the hesitation of improvisation. The lodges were heated with fires built at exactly the right scale, the kind of efficiency that comes from people who understand precisely how much fuel a cold night requires and who don't waste any of it. And for the first time since the morning the Blackfoot came out of the North Timber, Osborne Russell was somewhere that survival wasn't a continuous, moment-by-moment management problem demanding his full attention. He was among people who knew how to be alive in this landscape. In their company, he could begin to heal. The winter of 1837 to 1838, which followed his recovery in the Shoshone camp, was by Russell's account one of the more severe he'd experienced in the mountains. He spent much of it in or near Shoshone communities, healing through September and October, trapping again by November when the hip allowed it, and doing what he consistently did regardless of the season's pressures: watching, noting, writing. The journal entries from this particular winter are among the most textured in the entire document, not the incident-focused passages of more eventful seasons, but something quieter and more observational. The record of a man who'd been slowed down enough by injury to see the daily texture of winter camp life in a way that continuous movement had never previously required of him. He describes the communal rhythms of the lodges with the care of someone paying genuine attention. He writes about children's games in the snowfields above camp. He records the way older men read the coming weather through signs he was still working to fully understand. He was present in this winter in a way that earlier seasons hadn't asked of him. What those months revealed about Russell was the depth of his integration into a community that stretched well beyond any single cultural tradition. He wasn't a stranger healing among people who were tolerating his presence. He communicated in the Plains Indian Sign Language that served as the common trade language across the mountain region. He spoke enough Shoshone to hold practical conversation, and he was trusted with information, game movement observations, conditions in specific drainages, intertribal political developments, that wasn't shared with casual outsiders or people who hadn't demonstrated over time that they understood the terms of the relationship. The Shoshone community that sheltered and assisted him wasn't acting out of charity toward a helpless stranger. They were honouring a reciprocal relationship with someone who had, over years, behaved in ways that made him genuinely worth the investment. The practical skills Russell drew on through the difficult months of late 1837 and early 1838 represent the full curriculum of 9 mountain years, applied under conditions that tested every lesson. He knew how to build a fire in wet autumn conditions, a skill whose apparent simplicity conceals specific knowledge of tinder identification under snow cover, fire structure that shields a new flame from wind and moisture, and the careful progression from spark to sustainable combustion without wasting the limited dry material at hand. He knew how to assess ice thickness on a stream before committing to a crossing. The primary test is acoustic. A high, clear ring under pressure means adequate depth. A dull thud means marginal, and marginal means don't. He knew which direction wind came from in different valley configurations, because that determined shelter placement and hunting approach. He knew all of this not because he'd been born with any particular gift for it, but because someone had taught him, and because he'd paid close enough attention to carry it correctly when the circumstances actually required it. By the spring of 1838, the hip had healed enough to ride and trap at something close to his previous capacity. He came out of that winter changed, in ways the journal doesn't name directly, but that a reader who follows him from 1834 onward can sense in the texture of what he writes after. More deliberate, more attentive to the specific conditions of each particular situation, more willing to stop when something didn't match his existing understanding and wait for more information before committing to a course of action. The Lamar Valley attack had stripped away some residual assumption that accumulated experience was sufficient protection against catastrophe, and replaced it with a more precisely calibrated sense of what the mountain actually required. If that recalibration made him a more effective survivor, it also made him a sharper observer of everything unfolding around him, including the forces that were beginning by 1838 to make the entire mountain enterprise feel like something drawing toward a close rather than continuing. On a January morning in 2022, a Colorado search and rescue team recovered a body from a snow-covered slope in the San Juan Mountains, about 40 miles from the nearest town. The man was in his early 30s, and he was well equipped by any standard a sporting goods store would apply. He was wearing a layered synthetic insulation system rated to temperatures well below what the forecast had predicted. He had an avalanche transceiver, a probe, and a collapsible shovel, the standard safety kit for backcountry travel in avalanche terrain. He had GPS. He had a personal locator beacon. What the subsequent investigation suggested he didn't have was the knowledge to recognize before committing to that slope the specific combination of snow crystal structure, aspect angle, solar loading history, and recent wind deposition that his chosen route represented. He had the gear. He didn't have the language to read the mountain he was standing on, and the mountain didn't wait for him to acquire it. In the 2 years following the initial spread of COVID-19, outdoor recreation in America underwent one of the most dramatic participation expansions in its recorded history. National park visitation reached all-time highs in 2021. Trail running, backcountry skiing, bikepacking, and wilderness camping surged among populations with no prior history in those activities. Backcountry skiing in particular, travel through unpatrolled, uncontrolled mountain terrain, typically in avalanche country, saw an estimated 40 to 50% increase in participants across the 2020 to 2021 and 2021 to 2022 seasons. And with that surge came a proportional rise in accidents. Avalanche deaths in the United States reached their highest recorded total in the 2020-21 season, 37 fatalities. The American Avalanche Association's incident database for that season noted, with the careful specificity of people trying to identify patterns, that many of the victims were relatively new to backcountry travel and hadn't completed formal avalanche safety training beyond a basic introductory level. The parallel to the Rocky Mountain Trapper era isn't about a technology gap, because the technology gap runs in the opposite direction from the danger. A modern backcountry skier has access to equipment that would have seemed extraordinary to Osborne Russell. Synthetic insulation systems that provide warmth-to-weight ratios no animal fur can match. GPS devices accurate to within a few feet. Emergency beacons that can bring a rescue team over a mountain in 15 minutes. Freeze-dried food that delivers complete nutrition in a package the size of a paperback. None of this would Russell have refused. Rational people use the best tools available to them. The problem isn't the gear. The problem is the assumption, persistent, culturally reinforced and commercially encouraged by the outdoor industry, that the gear is the knowledge, that owning the equipment is functionally equivalent to understanding the environment in which it's being used. The mountain men of the 1830s could have told you, from direct personal experience, exactly how catastrophically wrong that assumption can get. The failure patterns that appear in avalanche accident reports year after year follow a recognizable sequence that Osborne Russell would have identified without difficulty. Overconfidence in equipment functioning as a substitute for environmental literacy, underestimation of specific terrain, based on a mismatch between prior experience and the actual conditions of the current situation. Failure to read the immediate particular signs that this slope, on this day, in these specific conditions, is different from the general category of slopes where prior experience was gathered. Commitment to a plan past the point at which new information from the environment should have changed it, and most fundamentally, an insufficient base of embodied, place-specific experiential knowledge about how this particular mountain under this particular winter's conditions, actually behaves. Russell spent 9 years building exactly that kind of understanding, absorbing it from Shoshone teachers and Crow guides and from his own accumulated mistakes. The gap between what he knew after 9 consecutive winters and what a modern backcountry enthusiast can develop through weekend courses and a few annual trips isn't primarily a gap in technology or intention. It's a gap in duration, continuity, and the particular quality of teaching. There's a subset of modern outdoor culture that specifically tries to engage with the kind of knowledge the mountain men possessed. The primitive skills community, wilderness survival schools, practitioners of traditional bow making, fire starting, and hide tanning, who approach those techniques with genuine dedication. Some have reached levels of competence in specific areas that are genuinely impressive, but even the most dedicated among them will acknowledge, if the question is asked honestly, that what they're doing is visiting the knowledge, not inhabiting it. Russell's competence was the product of 9 consecutive years of full-time life-or-death application, constantly corrected by an environment that had no interest in being gracious about his errors, supported by Indigenous teachers whose own understanding was the product of thousands of years of continuous engagement with that specific landscape. This isn't an argument that the old ways were simply better. They weren't better. They were appropriate to conditions that the vast majority of people who romanticize them would not voluntarily choose to live under for 9 straight years. What the comparison reveals is a specific and measurable gap between what the Rocky Mountain winter actually required in terms of embodied environmental intelligence, and what any modern training program can reliably produce in the time available to people with lives organized around other obligations. What this gap means for people who head into the winter mountains today isn't that they're all going to die. The overwhelming majority of backcountry users have safe and meaningful experiences out there. But it does suggest that the surge in backcountry access, combined with the outdoor industry's tendency to frame equipment as the primary lens for engaging with the wilderness, has produced a population of mountain users whose confidence, in some cases, genuinely and measurably exceeds their actual competence. And that gap between confidence and competence is precisely what a winter mountain is most efficient at exposing. Russell understood this from his own experience. His journal is full of passages where he consciously defers to Shoshone knowledge he doesn't yet possess, asks questions he doesn't already know the answers to, holds his own prior judgment in check until the current situation has offered enough new information to warrant a decision. That practice, that specific discipline of knowing what you don't know and acting accordingly, wasn't merely a virtue in his world. It was, in the most direct and measurable sense, the thing that kept him alive. The question of what we've gained and what we've quietly given up in the 2 centuries since Russell packed his final season of pelts and walked out of the mountains for good isn't answered by avalanche statistics or recreation data alone, though both have things to say. The mountain is still there, the winter is unchanged, and the question of whether anyone in sufficient numbers will take the historical record seriously, will commit to the kind of sustained, humble, relationship-based learning it actually describes, is one of the more quietly urgent survival questions the American West is currently asking. The beaver is, from an ecological engineering standpoint, one of the most productive animals on the North American continent. Its dam-building activity creates wetland habitat of extraordinary diversity and output. A single active beaver complex can multiply the biodiversity of a mountain stream valley several times over. Nesting habitat for waterfowl, concentrated forage at wetland edges for elk and deer, spawning pools and winter refuge for trout, and water storage that softens spring flooding and summer drought in the valleys below. The Rocky Mountains of 1820, before the intensive trapping era took hold, were a beaver-rich landscape that had been functioning as an integrated ecological system, complex, productive, and roughly in balance, for at least 10,000 years of post-glacial climate. By 1840, the beaver in most accessible Rocky Mountain stream systems were commercially extinct. Not biologically gone, small remnant populations held on in the most remote headwaters, but reduced past any threshold of economic relevance. The landscape was different, quieter, drier, and what the full consequences of that change would ultimately be was a question nobody in 1840 had the ecological framework to answer. Here's the first unresolved debate of the mountain man era. What did 2 decades of intensive beaver trapping actually do to the Rocky Mountain watershed system? And how much of the current landscape is still carrying the weight of that alteration? Modern ecologists who've studied the question have found measurable evidence of stream system changes, increased channel erosion, reduced wetland coverage, altered riparian vegetation patterns that can be traced with reasonable confidence to the collapse of the beaver population in the 1820s and 1830s. When the dams were removed, the ponds drained, productive wetland converted into fast-moving stream channels that cut deeper into their beds, carried more sediment, and supported far less of the life that had depended on the standing water. Some of this is still visible in the current landscape. Some of it has since been modified by other human activity: overgrazing, logging, water diversion, layering additional changes on top of the original disruption. The most honest ecological answer to how much damage the trapping era caused is substantial, partially irreversible, and still not fully measured. The second great debate is morally charged in a way that makes it harder to engage with honestly, and more important to engage with precisely for that reason. The mountain man era was the economic and geographical leading edge of American westward expansion. And for the indigenous peoples of the Rocky Mountain region, that expansion was a catastrophe of continental scale that unfolded across several decades in stages. The fur trade era itself wasn't the most violently dispossessive phase. That came later, with the settler migrations, the military campaigns, the broken treaties, and the formal reservation system. But what the trapping era did accomplish was the mapping, the route building, and the practical knowledge development that made the subsequent migrations possible. The Oregon Trail was built on trapper knowledge. The California Trail was built on trapper knowledge. Every overland route that carried hundreds of thousands of settlers west in the 1840s and 1850s was grounded in the geographical work of the fur trade era. The question of moral responsibility, of what the mountain men owed to the communities their work ultimately helped displace, is one that historians continue to answer differently, depending on whether they hold individuals accountable for the structural consequences of the systems they participated in. Osborne Russell is a complicated figure in that moral accounting. By the standards of his era, his journal is unusually attentive and respectful toward the native peoples he encountered across 9 years in the mountains. He records their languages, customs, and specific knowledge with a consistency and care that sets his writing apart from the more dismissive accounts of Native Americans that filled much of the popular and official record of the period. He also records, with that same matter-of-fact clarity, the displacement pressures that the expanding trapper presence was creating in the mountain region. The increasing scarcity of game in areas heavily worked by brigades, the tensions at territorial boundaries as the fur trade pushed communities up against each other. He doesn't editorialize about any of it, but there's a quality in the later journal entries that suggests a man who is beginning to notice, without being fully able to process, the relationship between his presence in those mountains and the deteriorating conditions of the people who'd been living in them long before he arrived. The third debate concerns what the mountain man mythology has done to American culture in the century and a half since the actual era ended, and whether that mythology has been a harmless romance or a genuinely distorting force. On one side are historians and cultural critics who argue that the lone wolf mountain man ideal has caused measurable harm, reinforcing a version of individualism that erases the role of collective support structures, naturalizing the appropriation of indigenous knowledge while simultaneously erasing the communities who developed it, and providing cultural cover for a particular variety of white masculine exceptionalism that's been put to use in American political life in various forms across 2 centuries. On the other side are historians who find genuine and transferable value in what the mountain man tradition represents, a willingness to engage the physical world directly, to build competence through sustained and demanding experience, to develop knowledge through relationship with specific places rather than through institutional mediation. Both arguments have empirical grounding. Neither one fully cancels the other. Environmental historians add a fourth dimension. Whether the fur trade's practitioners, the individual trappers, as distinct from the company executives who set the economic terms, understood or cared about the ecological consequences of their work. The evidence is genuinely mixed. Some trappers noted in their journals and letters the declining beaver sign in areas that had been heavily worked and adjusted their routes accordingly, a response that was pragmatic rather than conservationist, but one that at least acknowledged the finite nature of the resource. Others treated the landscape as essentially unlimited. Russell's journal shows him paying more attention than most to ecological conditions, noting stream health, game abundance, vegetation patterns, in a way that reads, in retrospect, as something approaching environmental awareness, even if it wasn't framed in any language of conservation. What historians still actively debate, without any resolution that fully satisfies, the precise pre-contact beaver population, and whether post-1840 levels represent meaningful recovery or permanent reduction. The extent to which individual trappers understood the systemic consequences of their individual decisions. Whether the rendezvous system was primarily exploitative of indigenous participants, or mutually beneficial in terms that those communities themselves evaluated and consented to, and the appropriate way to present the mountain man legacy in public historical spaces, museums, national park interpretations, school curricula, that serve audiences with very different relationships to that history. The most honest thing that can be said about the great debate surrounding the mountain man era is that it doesn't resolve. And the refusal to resolve is actually informative rather than frustrating. The era was genuinely complex. The trappers were simultaneously skilled workers, ecological actors, cultural intermediaries, and the involuntary advance party of an expansion that eventually destroyed much of what they'd built their lives upon. The mythology that succeeded them was at once a celebration of real human achievement and a distortion that served specific political purposes at the expense of historical honesty. Holding all of that in mind at the same time, without collapsing it into a simple story of heroes and villains, is the kind of work the mountain man era demands from anyone willing to engage with it seriously. And the structural changes that era set in motion extended far beyond the trapping grounds of the Rockies, into the legal and political foundations of a nation still living quietly with the consequences. In the spring of 1843, a wagon train of approximately 1,000 settlers departed from Independence, Missouri, and headed west along a trail that fur trade brigades had walked, ridden and memorized for more than a decade. They followed the Platte River across the Nebraska plains. They climbed through the foothills of the Rockies in what is now Wyoming, and arrived at the Continental Divide at South Pass, a broad, gentle crossing at just over 7,000 feet that looked, to people who had been expecting a dramatic wall of peaks, almost anticlimactic in how accessible it was. The ground was firm enough to drive heavily loaded wagons across without unloading them. The grade was gradual enough that draft oxen could manage it without extraordinary effort. This was not a geographical coincidence the emigrants stumbled upon. South Pass had been identified, assessed, and put to regular use by Rocky Mountain Fur Company trappers since 1824, when Jedediah Smith and a small party crossed it and recognised its value with the practical eye of men, always calculating how to move large quantities of goods through difficult country. The trail leading to that crossing, and beyond it to the Columbia River and the Pacific coast, had been walked into existence by the boots of mountain men who had no idea they were building the infrastructure of the largest voluntary mass migration in American history. The geographical contribution of the Rocky Mountain Trapper era to American continental expansion is almost impossible to overstate when you consider what followed. The mountain men were, in practical terms, the most comprehensive geographical survey the United States government never formally funded. John C. Fremont's famous expeditions of 1842 and 1843, whose reports became the primary geographical reference for emigrants planning overland routes to Oregon and California, were guided by men whose mountain knowledge made Fremont's scientific instruments meaningful rather than simply accurate. Kit Carson guided Fremont's 1842 expedition to South Pass. Other former trappers served as route scouts, river crossing advisors, and terrain interpreters for the expeditions and emigrant trains that followed. Jim Bridger established Fort Bridger on the Oregon Trail in 1843, a supply and repair point that became critical infrastructure for the emigrant traffic of the following decade. The route choices, the water sources, the river crossing locations, the campsite positions, the timing guidelines, virtually every element of Oregon Trail logistics was grounded in knowledge accumulated during the fur trade years. Osborne Russell's specific contribution to that geographical knowledge base was concentrated in the Yellowstone region, which he visited multiple times between 1835 and 1840, and described with a precision that remained among the best available first-person accounts for decades. His descriptions of the Yellowstone Basin's geothermal features, the geysers, hot springs, mud pots, obsidian cliffs, and rivers that ran warm even in the depths of winter, were scientifically useful long before formal expeditions arrived, because they provided a detailed eyewitness geography of a region that most Americans of the 1840s assumed was exaggerated when they heard about it. His account of the area he called Secluded Valley, the Lamar Valley, the site of his 1837 attack, and one of his most frequently revisited campsites, is specific enough that a modern reader familiar with the current Yellowstone landscape can identify exactly where he was standing when he wrote particular passages. He was, in some consequential sense, the first sustained American literary witness to what would eventually become the nation's first national park, designated in 1872. The legal and political consequences of the Mountain Man era extended well beyond the geographical into the diplomatic and constitutional. The American claim to the Oregon Territory, disputed with Great Britain through the early 1840s in negotiations that were, at their foundation, arguments about prior presence and economic use, was supported by decades of American fur trade activity in the region. American trappers had been working the Snake River drainage and the Columbia River watershed since the early 1820s, and that commercial presence, documented in company records, government expedition reports, and the personal accounts of men like Russell, formed part of the historical argument for American territorial rights below the 49th parallel. The Oregon Treaty of 1846, which established the current US-Canada boundary, was shaped in part by that argument. The American claims to Mexican-held California and the interior Southwest that led to the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 were similarly supported by a decade of geographical knowledge developed during the fur trade era. The ecological consequences of the fur trade's beaver depletion have been partially, but not fully, addressed by subsequent conservation work. Beaver reintroduction programs, formal strategies in which wildlife managers capture beaver from areas with healthy populations and release them into historically occupied but currently empty drainages, are active in multiple Rocky Mountain states, including Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and Montana. These efforts have produced measurable improvements in wetland coverage, stream health, riparian vegetation, and watershed function in the areas where they have taken hold, but they're working against a landscape baseline that was permanently altered by the fur trade's depletion. In some drainages, the erosion and channel cutting that followed the original population collapse has changed the physical structure of the stream bed to a degree that makes successful beaver re-establishment significantly harder. The fur trade created an ecological debt in the Rocky Mountain watershed. 2 centuries later, we're still making payments on it. The cultural consequence that has perhaps proven most durable and most contested is the template the Mountain Man era established for American attitudes toward wilderness, self-sufficiency, and masculine identity. The figure of the competent man alone in the wild, needing nothing from institutional support or collective structures, has been adapted across successive generations into the cowboy, the frontiersman, the rugged outdoorsman, the prepper, the survivalist, and various other archetypes that continue to generate significant political and cultural energy in contemporary America. The specific values encoded in that mythology, the primacy of individual capability over collective support, a deep suspicion of dependency, the idea that physical toughness signals genuine moral worth, are traceable in American political life across a range of debates that have nothing superficially to do with mountain men or beaver trapping. The mountain man is gone. The cultural inheritance he left behind is very much alive. There's also a cartographic legacy that's easy to overlook, because it's been so thoroughly absorbed into subsequent geographical understanding that its origins have become invisible. The names of Rocky Mountain geographical features are substantially the nomenclature introduced or formalized during the fur trade era by men who labeled places after themselves, their employers, their associates, or their passing impressions. Henry's Fork, Bridger Lake, the Wind Rivers, Jackson Hole. These names are now so embedded in the geographical vocabulary of the American West that their origins in a 20-year stretch of trapping activity require active historical recovery to recognize. The mountain men named the West in the process of working it, and the names held, which means they're still present in the landscape in a way that's genuinely continuous with the present moment, audible in every weather report, every topographic map, every national park sign that uses the geography they labelled. The men who built all of this were, when the fur trade era ended, largely forgotten or absorbed into the mythology that replaced them. Some of the most significant geographical contributions were made by men who left no name on any feature and no journal that survived them, men who worked a drainage system for 5 years and then disappeared entirely from the record when the trade collapsed. The institutional beneficiaries of their work, the emigrant trail companies, the military expeditions, the territorial governments, the Continental Railroad, built what they built on a foundation of knowledge that was rarely acknowledged and never compensated. The mountain men gave America the West. America gave the mountain men a mythology. Whether that was a fair exchange is one of the questions this story quietly leaves open. The light in the Willamette Valley of Oregon Territory in March is soft and diffuse. Grey-green in the way Pacific coastal light is grey-green, arriving at a low angle and spreading evenly across the valley floor without the hard-edged shadows that Rocky Mountain winter light cuts into everything. It's a gentler light, less demanding. illuminating a landscape of extraordinary agricultural promise. Rich alluvial soil, reliable rainfall, a growing season that runs far longer than anything the high country offers. Osborne Russell arrived in this valley in 1843 at the age of 29, after 9 years in the mountains, and the journal, which had recorded with such extraordinary care every significant development of those 9 years, contains almost nothing about what it felt like to leave. No farewell to the Lamar Valley, no reflection on the weight of the buffalo robe, packed away now and probably never to be worn again in quite that way. He recorded the fact of his departure and the direction of his travel, and then the entry shifted in subject matter, and he was already, with the quiet efficiency of a man who didn't spend energy on sentiment that couldn't be put to use, becoming someone new. Russell's relatively successful adaptation to post-mountain life was, by the evidence of the historical record, unusual among the men who'd shared his world. The broader story of the Rocky Mountain trapper community after 1840 is substantially a story of failed transitions. Men who'd spent their prime years in a world that rewarded extreme and specific competence, wilderness navigation, indigenous language fluency, firearms skill, fast tactical decision-making under mortal pressure, the physical capacity to function in brutal cold for months at a time, found themselves in a settler society that rewarded entirely different abilities: agricultural knowledge, financial literacy, political participation in developing civic institutions, the social patience that comes from living in communities where everyone is close enough together that individual behaviour has collective consequences. The cognitive and cultural gap was often simply unbridgeable. A man who'd spent 9 years learning to read weather systems and beaver behaviour and Blackfoot tactical movement couldn't simply redirect that intelligence toward crop rotation and land claim documentation. Many of them tried, many of them failed, and many spent the rest of their lives as scouts, guides, and increasingly marginal figures on the edges of the civilization their own labour had helped bring west. Kit Carson's post-mountain path is worth examining alongside Russell's as a counterpoint. Carson had been among the most skilled and widely recognised trappers of the era, and his work as Fremont's guide launched a subsequent career as an army officer and Indian agent that made him one of the most famous men in America by the Civil War. But that career placed him in roles that required enforcing, often with direct military force, the dispossession of the very indigenous communities within which his mountain years had been lived, and upon whose knowledge his survival had partly depended. He participated in the forced relocation known as the Long Walk of the Navajo in 1864, in which thousands of Navajo people were marched several hundred miles from their homeland to a reservation at Bosque Redondo, an operation that caused mass death from exposure, starvation, and disease. Carson died in 1868. His biography demonstrates, in concentrated form, how the skills and relationships of the mountain world could be redirected, in different institutional contexts and under different pressures, into either the partnership that the mountain had required or the violence that the subsequent era demanded. The man and the abilities were the same. The context changed what they built. Russell's path was different, in ways that seem almost incongruously institutional given where he'd come from. After arriving in Oregon, he established himself as a farmer, then as a merchant in the small commercial economy of the growing settlement, and eventually as a probate judge in the Provisional Government of Oregon Territory, one of the first American governing bodies west of the Rockies, established by settlers before Congress had formally extended territorial status to the region. He served in that judicial capacity with a competence he apparently developed through the same combination of applied intelligence and independent self-education that had made him a skilled trapper and a disciplined writer. He married, built a household, had children, constructed a life that looked from any external vantage point entirely conventional in the terms of mid-19th century frontier settlement. The man who'd slept through snowstorms, been shot with Blackfoot arrows, and eaten grasshoppers in the Yellowstone country was also, it turned out, a man who could learn property law, manage domestic affairs, and participate in municipal governance. He contained both. Most people who become one thing also carry within them the capacity to become another. The mountains simply delayed that discovery. But the transition cost something, as all transitions do, even the successful ones. The Journal of a Trapper, maintained with such disciplined care through 9 mountain years, producing in the process one of the most vivid and historically valuable first-person accounts of American frontier life in the entire 19th century, stops in 1843. There are no Willamette Valley entries, no agricultural notes written in the style of the Mountain Journal. The subject that had made him a writer was the mountain itself, and when the mountain was gone, the writing stopped. Or if it continued in some form, it didn't survive. What this suggests about Russell's inner life, whether he mourned the loss of that world, whether the Willamette Valley farm ever felt like home the way the Lamar Valley had felt like home when he camped there in the winter of 1836 and called it the most beautiful place he'd ever seen, is something the historical record simply can't answer. He left behind the journal of who he was in the mountains. He left behind very little of who he was after. The physical toll of those years on the men who survived them was, by the evidence of the historical and medical records, considerable and lasting. The nutritional extremes of the trapping life, periods of genuine abundance alternating with stretches of genuine starvation, had metabolic consequences that modern medicine would recognize as significant. The repeated cold injuries, the inadequately treated wounds, the physical labor performed at the outer limits of human endurance, these accumulated across years into a legacy that made the surviving trappers, by their 40s, substantially older than their age by any conventional measure. Russell's 9 years were probably the equivalent, in terms of wear on the body, of 15 to 20 years of most other kinds of work available in the 1830s American economy. The deeper transformation that the mountain produced in these men, the specific reshaping of perception and priority and cognitive habit that extended duration in an extreme environment creates, was also something that settler life had limited use for. A man who'd spent 9 years reading weather systems, animal behavior, terrain, and human tactical intention in a continuous life-stakes way, had developed a perceptual apparatus calibrated to demands that ordinary civilian life didn't reproduce. The vigilance that kept you alive in Blackfoot country in 1837 was disruptive and exhausting in a Willamette Valley farmhouse in 1845. The capacity to make fast decisions under mortal pressure with incomplete information didn't translate into any clearly valued skill in the emerging legal and commercial culture of the Oregon settlement. The mountain men carried their competence with them, and for many of them, that competence had nowhere left to go. Osborne Russell lived until 1892, which means he survived long enough to see Oregon admitted to the Union, long enough to see the completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869, long enough to watch the Indian Wars convert the complex, contingent, reciprocal partnerships of the mountain world into formal, violent dispossession on a continental scale, and long enough to see the Yellowstone country he'd camped in, mapped, and described so carefully set aside as the world's first national park in 1872, a recognition of that landscape's extraordinary character that he'd been quietly recording in his journal since 1835. He left no public statement of what he made of any of it. The journal had stopped in 1843. Whatever he thought about the world his 9 mountain years had helped make possible, the routes that carried the settlers, the geographical knowledge that guided the armies, The mythology that outlasted and distorted everything else, he kept to himself. But the understanding his 9 winters had built into him, the specific earned knowledge of what survival actually requires, that's a different kind of legacy, one that doesn't need a journal entry to be real. There's a moment in Russell's journal, somewhere in the winter of 1839, that reads almost like a footnote. But if you're paying attention, it carries the weight of an entire philosophy of survival. He and a companion have been travelling through heavy snow for 2 days, forcing their way through chest-deep drifts in the open, working around timber deadfall, moving at a pace that's exhausting even by their standards. They've arrived at a junction where 2 valleys split in different directions. He has to choose. One valley he's travelled before, in better conditions. The other he hasn't travelled in winter. He writes that he considered the options for some time before deciding. Not a long deliberation, a few minutes at most, but some time, in a journal written by a man conserving paper who rarely expanded on anything he considered obvious. He chose the Western Valley. He was right. He records this without fanfare, as a plain fact. But the process he describes, the pause, the honest assessment, the acknowledgement that prior experience in one direction wasn't sufficient to override genuine uncertainty about current conditions, is the heart of everything this story has been quietly building toward. Here is what the Rocky Mountain Trapper era, examined with full honesty, actually teaches. Survival isn't primarily a function of strength, courage, equipment quality, or individual willpower. Though none of those things are irrelevant, it's a function of knowledge, and more specifically, of the honest assessment of the gap between what you know and what the current situation actually requires you to know. The mountain men who died, and a significant percentage of them did die, typically didn't lose their lives because they lacked courage or physical capacity. They died because they were operating on assumptions about their own knowledge that the situation didn't support. They crossed rivers they hadn't crossed in current conditions. They moved through Blackfoot country with a level of confidence their experience in different territory didn't actually warrant. They committed to plans that the specific, immediate, particular character of the moment they were in had already made inadequate. They knew enough to be confident. They didn't know enough to be safe. In the Rocky Mountains in January, that gap between confidence and genuine competence gets measured in something other than discomfort. This wisdom is counterintuitive in the context of what American culture has historically celebrated, and that counterintuitiveness is part of what makes it worth sitting with carefully. The mythology of the mountain man tells a story about the sufficiency of individual strength and determination. The actual history of mountain survival tells the opposite. Consistently, and without exception, across the entire historical record of the era, the men who lasted were the men who most quickly recognized the limits of their own individual knowledge and who were most genuinely willing to seek and receive knowledge from sources they hadn't expected and didn't control. Russell survived 9 years in the Rockies because he treated the Shoshone as teachers before he ever needed them as rescuers, because he wrote down what he observed and returned to those observations, building a personal knowledge base that could be corrected by what came next, because he paused at junctions in the snow when he wasn't certain enough to be confident, and waited for the situation to offer more information before moving. These aren't the virtues the mythology celebrates, but they are, without exception, the virtues that explain who came out of the mountains alive. The specific intellectual capacity at the centre of Russell's survival practice, the one that appears most consistently across 9 years of entries, is what modern cognitive psychology would call metacognition. The ability to think about how you're thinking, to evaluate the quality of your own knowledge rather than simply acting from within it, to ask before committing to a river crossing or a route choice, or a tactical decision, not what do I know about this, but rather, how reliable is what I know, given that these specific conditions may differ from the ones in which I first learned it? That second question, the one that interrogates the knowledge itself rather than simply applying it, is what Russell's journal shows him asking again and again in situations where the first question alone would have produced a confident but potentially wrong answer. The ability to ask that second-order question is rare in any era. In the Rocky Mountains in the 1830s, it was a survival skill with a measurable mortality differential. There's a counterintuitive corollary to all of this. Accumulated experience creates a specific category of risk, as well as a specific category of protection. And managing that risk requires a kind of conscious attention that becomes harder to maintain precisely as experience accumulates. Russell demonstrates this himself in the Lamar Valley in August of 1837. He knew that valley. He'd camped there before. He understood it in the way a man understands a place he's passed through often enough that it feels familiar rather than threatening. And that familiarity, that accumulated knowledge that should have been an asset, contributed to the relative ease with which the Blackfoot caught his group without adequate warning. A known place is, in a specific and consequential way, more dangerous than an unknown one, because familiarity quietly softens the vigilance that keeps a person alert to the ways the current moment might differ from the one they remember. This insight, that competence and complacency are neighbours rather than opposites, and that managing the distance between them takes active and continuous effort, runs through the Rocky Mountain trapper story from beginning to end. It's present in the accounts of men who made it through seasons that killed their companions. It's present in the records of men who didn't survive seasons that should have been manageable. And it's present throughout Russell's journal in the form of his consistent willingness to record moments of uncertainty, moments of deferred judgment, moments where he explicitly acknowledges he doesn't know something and is waiting to find out. That wasn't weakness. In the mountain world he was moving through, it was the most important kind of strength. The capacity to hold an open question open rather than closing it prematurely with an answer that felt confident, but hadn't been earned. What Russell's hard-won understanding looks like, translated out of the 19th century Rocky Mountain context into recognizable modern terms, is something like this. The most dangerous knowledge is the knowledge that stops you from learning. More precisely, the most dangerous moment in the development of any competence is when you know enough to feel confident, but not yet enough to recognize what you're still missing. Every skilled practitioner in any genuinely complex field, surgery, aviation, professional climbing, emergency medicine, has some version of this insight built into their operating practice, often as a direct result of disasters that occurred when someone with considerable experience treated that experience as sufficient for a situation that was different from their prior cases in ways they hadn't noticed. The mountain was an earlier, harsher, and far more unforgiving version of the same classroom, and yet, if this wisdom was always available to anyone who read the evidence honestly, if Russell wrote it down clearly enough that 2 centuries of subsequent readers could draw it from his journal, then why did the mythology choose a different lesson? Why did American culture, given the full historical record of the mountain man era, select the lone wolf over the humble student, the self-made survivor over the man who knew what he didn't know? The answer to that question reaches beyond mythology. It's about the kind of identity America decided to build from this history, and what that identity has meant for the country that built itself around it. There's a painting that appears in several American history museums, variations of the same compositional idea. executed by different artists across the 19th century, that shows a solitary figure in buckskins standing on a mountain prominence against a wide open sky. He's looking west, or sometimes directly at the viewer, with an expression that manages to be simultaneously fierce and serene. Self-contained, expansive. He holds a long rifle. He stands alone. The mountains behind him are magnificent and entirely subordinate to his presence. This is the image America chose to keep from the mountain man era. And the fact that it was chosen deliberately and has been maintained across 2 centuries of revision and reinterpretation tells you something precise and important about what the mountain man has been asked to mean, which is something quite different from what the mountain man actually was. The mythology of the solitary figure in the wilderness wasn't assembled casually or innocently. It was constructed with purpose at specific historical moments by people who needed it to do specific cultural work. In the 1840s, as the real fur trade era was ending and the settlement of the West was beginning in earnest, the mythology started crystallizing around accounts like Kit Carson's and the published reports of Fremont's expeditions, documents that transformed the chaotic, communal, indigenous knowledge-dependent reality of the trapping world into a narrative of American masculine destiny that the era's expansion politics required. In the 1880s and 1890s, as the frontier officially closed and Western settlement was declared complete, the mythology was amplified by dime novelists, Wild West show promoters, and early filmmakers who understood that Americans wanted to remember the West as a story of heroic individuals, rather than as the complex, contested, violent, and ecologically costly process it had actually been. Each amplification added another layer of distance between the mythology and the history. Each layer made the mythology more useful, and the actual record more uncomfortable to recover. The American identity that the mountain man mythology contributed to, the specific constellation of values that the figure encodes and passes forward, is one of the most recognizable and consequential features of the national character. The deep suspicion of institutional dependence, the belief that individual capability is the primary measure of legitimate success, the persistent conviction that the right person, with the right skills and sufficient determination, can handle whatever the world offers without requiring anything from anyone else. The feeling, buried but real, that asking for help is, at some fundamental level, a confession of inadequacy. These values are woven into American political culture at a depth that shows up in debates about healthcare access, public education funding, social insurance programs, and environmental regulation. Debates that seem, on their surface, to have nothing to do with beaver pelts or mountain passes in Wyoming. The argument that Americans should take care of themselves and that any form of collective provision represents a failure of individual character isn't a policy position that emerged from abstract principle. It has a genealogy, one that runs through a mythology built on a history it's significantly and deliberately misrepresented. There's a dimension of American identity that the mountain man mythology actively suppresses, and the suppression itself is a historical consequence that deserves attention. The actual trapper era was a story of profound cultural entanglement, of American, European, and indigenous knowledge systems in complex, consequential contact, producing a world that was genuinely unprecedented. The men who survived were the ones who learned from indigenous teachers. The routes they mapped were pointed out by guides whose families had walked them for generations. The food that carried them through the worst winters was grown, prepared, and shared by indigenous women, whose understanding of the winter landscape was the accumulated inheritance of 1,000 years of continuous presence. When we hold up the mountain man's knowledge of the wilderness as a model of American capability, we're very rarely acknowledging where that knowledge actually came from. The mythology of self-sufficiency has erased as its most basic structural operation, the community that made self-sufficiency possible. There's also a psychological dimension to the mountain man's enduring presence in American identity that goes beyond the political and the historical. The figure speaks to something genuinely deep in human experience, a longing for clarity, for a world reduced to essential problems with essential solutions, where your skills are either adequate or they're not, and the feedback is immediate and unambiguous. Modern American life is for most people almost entirely the opposite of this. Ambiguous feedback, diffuse accountability, outcomes shaped by systems far too large and complex for any individual to meaningfully influence. The mountain man mythology offers, in imagination if not in practice, a world where competence actually determines outcomes, where individual action produces individual consequences, where the relationship between what you know and whether you survive is as clear and unforgiving as the temperature in the Lamar Valley at dawn. That fantasy isn't foolish. It addresses a genuine human need. The problem isn't that people find it appealing. The problem is that the mythology consistently misrepresents what that clarity actually required, the network of teachers, partners, and community that made it possible for any individual to develop and maintain the competence the mountain demanded. What the actual history of Osborne Russell and the Mountain Man era offers American identity, not as a replacement for the mythology, but as a necessary complication of it, is a portrait of a different kind of American. Not the lone wolf who needs nothing, a man who needed everything, who needed the Shoshone's knowledge of Yampa roots and buffalo robe preparation and weather reading and wound treatment, who needed the communal structure of the trapping brigade to provide safety margins in terrain that killed people who were working alone, who needed the sustained relationships of the rendezvous to maintain the supply chain and the social grounding that months of relative isolation steadily wore away, and who was, for all of that need, not diminished, not less capable or less admirable for having required what the mountain required every man to require. His competence was real. His survival was real. 9 years in some of the most demanding terrain in North America were real, and they were accomplished not in spite of his dependencies, but through them. The question the mountain man mythology has always refused to ask, and that the actual historical record consistently answers, is what kind of people we want to be when the environment gets genuinely difficult, not the version of difficult that gets dramatized on screen. The real version, the one where the stakes are mortal, the conditions exceed any single person's capacity to manage alone, and survival requires not just what you know, but the honesty to acknowledge the gap between what you know and what the situation actually demands. Osborne Russell knew that gap intimately, in ways the Lamar Valley had made permanently, scar tissue clear, and what he built inside that gap, the knowledge, the relationships, the intellectual discipline that kept him alive for 9 years in circumstances that claimed a third or more of his contemporaries, is the actual legacy of the Mountain Man era, not the painting on the museum wall, the journal, written by firelight in a small, careful hand by a man who never stopped paying attention. And the question it leaves hanging in the cold mountain air is one that every American who carries the mythology is still, in some quiet part of themselves, being asked to answer. Rewritten for AI voiceover narration, the Lamar Valley in January looks, from the road that now runs along its southern edge through Yellowstone National Park, almost exactly as Osborne Russell described it in the winter of 1836. The Lamar River still threads the valley floor over smooth, rounded stones. The elk still come down from the high timber in the early morning in long, unhurried lines, following the same routes they've followed for as long as there have been elk and valley grass, and the particular quality of January light that makes the scene look less like a landscape than like a memory of one, still, clear, and somehow already past even while it's happening. The mountains still rise to 10 and 12,000 feet on both sides, in the way that makes the valley feel held rather than exposed. The cold is still cold. The winter is still the winter. Nothing about the mountain itself has changed in the century and a half since Russell camped here and wrote about it by firelight in his careful, unhurried hand. What has changed? What is continuing to change in ways that the mountain's apparent permanence makes easy to miss is the relationship between the people who enter this valley and the knowledge required to survive it on the mountain's own terms. The road that carries visitors through the Lamar in January is kept open by snowplows running through weather that would have been immediately lethal to any person without adequate shelter in Russell's era. The heated vehicles moving along that road carry occupants who are, in any practical survival sense, completely disconnected from the environmental conditions just outside their windows, warm, well-fed, electronically connected to the wider world, dependent on a supply chain of fuel and mechanical reliability that extends back through a continent of industrial infrastructure to sources the Winter Mountain knows nothing about. The valley is unchanged. The relationship between the valley and the people passing through it has been almost entirely mediated. That mediation is not by itself a problem. It's the product of 2 centuries of accumulated technological and social development that has, in any honest accounting, preserved vastly more lives than the Mountain Man era's wilderness competence ever could have. The people in those heated vehicles in January aren't less intelligent or less capable than Osborne Russell. They're simply operating in a different system, with different dependencies, different skill requirements, and different knowledge appropriate to those requirements. The mediation fits the lives most people actually live. The problem isn't the mediation itself. The problem is the gap that mediation creates between confidence and comprehension, between the experience of being physically present in a landscape and the knowledge required to survive that landscape when the mediation fails. And it does fail. Roads close, vehicles break down, weather systems exceed the parameters that modern infrastructure was designed to handle. The supply chains, the fuel networks, the electronic connections that carry people through wild places are, in a specific and measurable technical sense, brittle in ways that the organic, adaptive, relationship-based knowledge of Russell and his Shoshone teachers was not. Systems built for average conditions fail at the extremes. The understanding that Russell carried, embodied, specific, continuously tested by an environment that didn't grade on a curve, wasn't brittle. It flexed, it adapted, it absorbed new information without losing the foundational understanding that made new information interpretable. It was, at the deepest structural level, alive in the way a relationship is alive rather than the way a machine is alive. What the Rocky Mountain Trapper era ultimately teaches us about the future isn't a cautionary tale about lost skills or dangerous softness or the degraded self-sufficiency of modern life. Those are the conclusions the mythology would draw, and they're as misleading about the future as they are about the past. What the era actually teaches is something more specific and more consequential, that the knowledge required to be genuinely safe in genuinely extreme environments is the product of a sustained, humble, relationship-based engagement with specific places and specific communities, the kind that modern life has systematically undervalued, and that the mythology of the lone self-sufficient survivor has actively obscured. But that knowledge isn't gone. It didn't disappear. The Shoshone community that kept Osborne Russell alive in the winter of 1837 still has descendants. The ecological intelligence of the Rocky Mountain landscape, the understanding encoded in the beaver's dam building, the elk's migration patterns, the whitebark pine's seed dispersal, the specific meteorological signs that Russell learned to read across 9 consecutive winters, is still operating in that landscape for anyone willing to be present long enough, humbly enough, and attentively enough to read it. The question that the mountain man era leaves open, the one the mythology has always tried to answer with a lone figure on a ridge, a rifle, and an empty horizon, is not whether any individual could survive a Rocky Mountain winter by force of personal will and superior skill alone. The historical record answers that definitively. No, not the best of them. Not even Russell, with 9 years of the mountain's curriculum carried in his body, with an arrow wound in his hip and no horses, no food, and 60 miles between himself and anyone who knew his name. What kept him alive wasn't solitude. It was the specific, irreplaceable, hard-won understanding of how not to be alone in a landscape that required something more than any individual could carry by himself. The future of the Rocky Mountain wilderness, like the future of every extreme environment that human beings will continue to encounter, whether by choice or by the slow, accumulating pressure of a climate already measurably rearranging the terms of survival in parts of the American West, won't be determined by any mythology of individual strength. It'll be shaped by the same fundamental dynamics that decided who survived the winters of the 1830s, the quality of the knowledge available, the breadth of the community that holds it, and the willingness of the people who enter the mountain to approach it with something closer to the humility that Osborne Russell took 9 full years to genuinely learn. The Lamar Valley in January is still there, the elk still move through the morning mist, the river still speaks to the stones in its bed in the same register it's been speaking in since before any American map ever named it, and somewhere in the cold at the edge of that water, in the particular stillness that follows a heavy snowfall and precedes whatever the mountain is quietly deciding to do next. The question that Russell carried into these mountains in 1834, young and hopeful and nowhere near as prepared as he believed, that question is still being asked, not of the mountain. The mountain doesn't ask questions, it simply presents conditions and waits with a patience that has no particular investment in the outcome, to see what the person standing in them actually knows. The answer, the one that determines everything that follows, has always been the same. It was never about being strong enough. It was always about being humble enough to learn. Some trappers survived months alone by trapping beaver along frozen rivers, their shelters no more than rough cabins buried in snow. They learned to read the silence of the mountains, because one wrong choice in winter could mean the end. Stories like this are why Bedtime Sleepy exists, to remember the quiet strength people carried through impossible seasons. Sleep gently now.